Welcome back. This week we're diving deep into being vulnerable and being healthy with Richard Tyler. Richard is a former West End lead in Phantom of the Opera who today works with entrepreneurs, CEOs and leadership teams. If you're new to the channel, my name's Neil Fellows, and in this series we're exploring health and wellness under the premise that some illnesses and diseases may be avoidable if we took proactive steps to prevent them. Each week I interview wellness experts and we dive deep into an aspect of health and wellness with the aim of giving you greater freedom to find what works for you as a unique individual. If you want to explore your health and wellness, please subscribe and hit the bell to get notified of all of our latest uploads as soon as they happen. And if this channel can help your friends and family, please also share it with them too. So this week, my guest is Richard Tyler and we're talking about being vulnerable and being healthy. So today we're talking about being vulnerable and being healthy. Richard, what does it mean to be vulnerable?
There are so many definitions, I think, of vulnerability, and I think we all tend to have our own sense of what it is. And for me, it's quite, I keep it quite simple that actually it's about how we are, I guess, open to making mistakes is the first part. I think there's a couple of parts of it. Our receptivity to making mistakes in the first place. And the second part, which I think in vulnerability is really key, which often gets missed, is about our owning them. And they're quite distinct. And I think we can often see if people will do the first bit, they won't often do the second bit. So it's about how open are we to getting stuff wrong, to failing, to having accidents, to tripping up, to following a path that maybe was not the path we expected to follow, but then that we own it and we're prepared to stand in our truth and be seen. And I think, vulnerability is about our being seen. Are we prepared to come into the room and, as Brené Brown would say, I guess, unarmored and not leaving our stuff at the door? Are we prepared to come into the room and bring all of our stuff into the room with us? And that's about being, I know showing up is quite a current trendy buzzword kind of expression. But I think it is about showing up, but it's about showing up unarmored. It's about showing up and allowing all facets of us to be visible, the light, and so the joy, the opportunity, the potential, but also the darkness as well, and our shadow side and the stuff we wrestle with and grapple with. How do we hold both of those and allow both of them to be visible, not just to ourselves, but visible to others?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I'm just thinking of like different scenarios, both at home and at work, where you walk into a room, as you were saying, and you've got some stuff going on. And how appropriate do you think it is like to unpack that as you to other people? Is it my stuff? What would you think about that?
I mean, I think for all of it, there's context specific, isn't there? And it's around, I don't think, I think we can't make vulnerability binary. We can't say it's kind of, it's vulnerable or not vulnerable. And it can be that black and white. It has to be on a sliding scale of how much we are prepared to disclose. And within there, there's a degree of thoughtfulness, I think, and reflection about the purpose of sharing. Who is it benefiting? What's in it for us in that moment? So if this is about us remaining connected to self, if I'm going to be disconnected from myself because I choose not to share it, then that's going to be problematic in that relationship. So if I walk into the room and go, oh, Neil won't want to see that. Neil's never very receptive to me saying things like this, that, and the other. So I just have to bury that bit. I can do that, but it's going to be problematic in the room with you in that moment. That stuff, when stuff is emerging and knocking on our door, it continues to knock on our door. So unconsciously, it will still be having an effect and an impact. So there's something about a thoughtfulness and intention that means wherever we are going, what's the purpose in serving it? Who is it for? Is it just for us because we want to unburden ourselves? Is it for the other person because we want to share, we want to disclose, we want to own something, we want to stand in our truth? But then are we doing it because we want to have an impact with them, or we want to demonstrate that we are being vulnerable rather than really being vulnerable. So I think, there's, people are complicated things, aren't they? We're complicated souls, and we're carrying a lot around with us.
Yeah.
And I think if we go at the most simplistic level, and really we're talking about how we're more conscious and aware and being deliberate in our choices, being deliberate in our actions. And that means before we go into a room, there's something deliberate about, again, what's the purpose of the interaction? What's the purpose of this moment? I might have 2 or 3 minutes with you. Is that right then that I come in and disclose everything in my life that's kind of tragic and difficult and terrible and all the things I've done wrong this morning? Probably not. That's probably going to get in the way. But I think for all of us, this is about the more awake we can be, the more we can navigate life, making decisions and choosing, rather than getting into our groove and just running on autopilot. And of course, when we do that is when we start to fall into survival personality, old habits, defense mechanisms. And most of that is, unconscious. It's all happening behind the scenes. We're not making that choice in the moment. And my encouragement is actually, if we're talking about how do we perhaps just nudge that vulnerability gauge on the continuum up, so we want to be slightly more vulnerable, then the first bit is to be making much more conscious choices around our intention, around our impact, around what we want from this relationship, what they want from this relationship. So we've got to be choosing that before we walk in the room. And then that's going to determine what are we giving away and what are we not giving away.
Sure. So 2 guys here, and we're talking about being vulnerable and being healthy. 2 guys at 20, we're talking about vulnerability. So where we're at the moment, is vulnerability still just for girls? I've got to ask this question.
Yeah, of course it is. Yeah. And this, we're in such an interesting time, aren't we? Where we are starting to loosen and untangle some of those patterns and stories about, you've made the distinction between men and women, what it means to be a man, what does it mean to be a man amongst men? And I think we're only beginning to loosen it, the tie on that. I still see, I'm part of quite a few men's groups on Facebook and men's mental health groups. And, I witness every day in there, whilst I see people who are being vulnerable and disclosing and owning their stuff, there's often a caveat at the end of their post that is something like, but I've got to be strong for my family. I've got to be tough for my wife. I've got to be tough for the kids. I don't want them to see me blubbering and sobbing. And so, we are starting to get there, but we've got a long way to go. But we have to start, I think, almost altering a new story of what vulnerability is and what it means to us now and what it can bring us. And that old story that was one of it's weak, specifically around weakness, of which we'd often have all those catchphrases around kind of, grow a pair, man up, pull up your bootstraps, put your big boy pants on. All of that stuff doesn't help us. And of course, we are still drowning in that culturally. We're still drowning in that. We're still drowning in kind of being the macho man. So we have a long way to go. And of course it isn't just for women. This is about within all of us. And those of you that have heard me talk before, I talk about kind of the masculine and feminine energy that we all have access to. And vulnerability is a very feminine quality. It's a much more heart-centered quality than a more masculine energy quality. And when I say masculine and feminine, I don't mean men and women. I mean that we all have access. Men and women have access to that masculine quality of direction, process, drive, momentum, adaptation, change. It does has a lot of forward momentum to it. And the feminine energy is more still and more heart-centered and felt rather than thinking. And that's where our vulnerability creeps through. So for someone that very much identifies themselves as a masculine man and being a strong man, there's going to be a bit more of an internal wrestle with understanding what vulnerability means for them. But we have to figure out, Neil, don't we, what it means for us. and how does the most masculine of men, or the most masculine energy within a woman, how do we allow the vulnerability to come through in a way that feels truthful for us? And this is, you know, it can't be just a one size fits all. It has to be people discovering for themselves, what does me showing up in my truth, owning my mistakes, and being open to, actually, I am infallible and I will get stuff wrong and I will stuff up. And
I really like that, what you're saying, because it's like, because vulnerability, you know, when you often think of that, when I think of it, I sort of perceive it sometimes as being people crying, or kind of like on that edge of falling to pieces. But it doesn't actually have to be that. I mean, it can just be just opening up, can't it? And just say, you know what, I'm just struggling with this for a few minutes. Can you just give me 5 minutes? Or
yeah, completely. And I think it's really important that you've flagged that up. And because I think that is a lot of the old narrative of vulnerability. It's about, that means I'm going to be weeping into my kind of box of tissues and kind of screaming and sobbing and wailing. And actually, it can be those things. Of course, it can be those things. And actually, there's still a really, there can still be a real adult quality in there, which is, it might just be asking for what we need. It might be asking for help. You know, we see, you know, certainly it takes times in our world, like, you know, a global crisis or a family crisis or something, where we may then be compelled to start asking for help. And we've seen a lot more of that around us in recent months, where people have, and perhaps that have never asked before, asking for help and saying, I need support. I need someone to do this thing for me. I can't do this anymore in this way. So we are seeing it, and that's the loosening piece. But there is a real adult quality to it. There is a, there's a sensitivity to it. There's a noticing something that's there.
And, honesty as well, isn't there, within this?
There is an honesty. It's the truthful piece. It's that we are prepared to stand and own our truth and stay connected to our truth. The moment we start to push our truth away and we disconnect from it, relationships, anything relational, is really difficult. But, you know, being relational in a healthy way means that I remain connected to you whilst remaining connected to self. So that piece is really important. Connecting with you whilst remaining connected to self. If I disconnect from self, then being vulnerable is almost impossible.
Yeah,
because we're not going to listen, we're not going to intuit, we're not going to understand, we're not going to be able to be sensitive to ourselves, whilst then being sensitive to another. So I think certainly in terms of, you know, people that are watching this and going, how do I for me find a place that is perhaps more vulnerable? That's a real starting point about actually what are the conversations that need to happen? What are the things that have been unsaid? It might just be, you know, there's a vulnerability in noticing that your partner looks really beautiful today, or that actually you really love the way she or he looks when they smile like that. And there's a vulnerability. There's a me offering a part of myself, a truth within me. I am offering to you. I think it's really great that you made that distinction, because there will be people going, surely this means I have to.
If you're watching this video and you're enjoying the content, please do hit the like button and make some comment below as well to let us know how the conversation is impacting you. It's always great to have that feedback. Richard, we've been talking about being vulnerable, being healthy. We've talked a bit about vulnerability. Let's talk a bit about the health side of this. How can being vulnerable lead to better health?
Well, I think we have lots of research. There is lots of scientific research that tells us very clearly that if we lose connection with ourselves, so that is our ability to bring our truth in and bring all of ourselves in. If we lose connection with ourselves, the impact on not just on our emotional and psychological health, but on our physiological health is there's such a strong interconnectedness that, you know, that there are schools of thought that would trace back serious illnesses that people have, that we go, well, that's cellular, that's nothing psychological in it. Actually, that there is a very clear psychological connection to the physical ailment. And one of those will be when we disconnect from ourselves, when we lose that that part of our voice, that part of us that we want to be able to bring out, when we bury that and we keep burying it, and we bury energetically, psychologically, that's having an impact on our bodies, on our physical well-being. I'm just suddenly remembering the name of the book that I can't remember the name of, so it's just a completely hopeless statement. And Anita Morjani, is that her name, who wrote the book about cancer?
Sounds familiar.
It's a great book, but maybe we can pop the link somewhere. In it, she makes that very clear connection between her cancer and her, emotional burying from a very early childhood, burying a part of ourselves to fit in culturally, kind of parental rules, parental guidelines, what was modeled. And she believes that part of herself got so locked away that there was an impact at a cellular level. So, we're in a mental health crisis for sure at the moment, and that seems to deepen rather than improve. So even just from a psychological perspective, the more we are disconnected from ourselves and burying our truth and burying our stories, and it stops us from being in flow. The world is in perfect flow. The sun knows how to rise, it knows how to set, the acorn knows how to grow into an oak tree. All of this wonderful cycle we have of nature, it knows how to do it perfectly. And if we attempt to get cleverer than nature and the universe is, we stuff stuff up. If I go and talk to my acorn in the garden and tell it to be a rose and beat it and berate it to be a rose, it might or might not grow into being an oak tree. And how healthy is it going to be as an oak tree anyway? But if we do the same thing with ourselves, and our whole system goes out the flow because we bury things, because we attempt to get clever. I shouldn't feel like that. I shouldn't disclose this. I shouldn't be crying. I shouldn't tell that person how I feel and show tears and emotion with it. If we're burying that, then we're stuffing up our entire systemic flow. And our bodies know how to heal. They know how to deal with pain. And the most problematic is that we get in the way of it. We think that we are cleverer. We want to resist feeling something, thinking something, doing something particular. So we don't create space for it. We don't give it room to be there. We don't give it a place. We don't acknowledge that it is there. That does, vulnerability doesn't mean we have to walk around wearing our heart on our sleeves with everything all day. It means we need to be giving space to everything that is within us. And it's when we bury it is that we start to recognize the problems that we will have psychologically or physiologically. I know that lots of people that I see therapeutically that come up with, that arrive with physical ailments, and that might be eczema and kind of joint conditions and back conditions, whilst something over time may have shifted in their structure and they're seeing an osteopath or a chiropractor to put their back right. Actually, there's a huge amount that is emotional and energetic. And when you start to look at plotting out their life and their history that they turn up with, there are lots of moments where you can then start to see what has culminated in this physical illness that, of course, we're inclined to go and treat as a physical thing, and we don't look at the whole system piece. We don't take the whole system into being, but we must.
Really interesting what you're saying, because as you're talking about the baggage and those kind of things, obviously when it's mental we don't see it. When it's physical we see it or we feel it, don't we? I'm just thinking that I just pulled a little muscle in the back of my arm here. I don't quite know where to call it because it's not quite the tricep, it's somewhere else. But pull this muscle here, and I know when it heals, it will probably overheal and it will restrict the movement. And you're talking about baggage. I think mentally, if you go through something where there's a high degree of stress, like a divorce or a job change or a moving house, or all of those three things happening within 6 months, because sometimes they do. And if we don't deal with the baggage that comes up at that time, then we're left with this scar tissue that's we're dragging around with us, and we're no longer as free to move as we were before.
Yeah, it's a really nice way of describing it, and I think I often talk about this idea of, if we get a splinter in our arm or a thorn in our arm, and we don't get rid of it in that moment, it's uncomfortable and sore and irritating, and then we realize it restricts a particular thing that we do. So maybe we choose not to. We still hug our partner, but we may go, oh, don't touch the side of my arm because it's really sore there, I've got a splinter in there. And the longer that goes on and it remains in there, we then start adapting the way we hug. So we don't hug them as we used to hug them because that's sore there, but we kind of buried that bit. We've forgotten about it. That's just how we hug. And then we brush past people differently. And so it has quite a significant impact then on how we navigate our days. But actually, we've lost sight of what this piece was if we don't deal with it at its cause. And I think that's, most of us will say we had happy childhoods. I believe I had a happy childhood. And actually, most of us in childhood will have some degree of wounding. Mm. And that doesn't mean wounding in the ways that lots of people will jump to thought of first, which is about, but that may have been physical abuse or verbal abuse or sexual abuse or any of those things where we go, wow, that's wounding. Most of us still have a degree of wounding where in an instant we didn't feel seen, or we didn't feel noticed, or we didn't feel listened to, or we felt that someone laughed our ideas, or that we were left in an elevator, or we couldn't find a guardian in a supermarket. We'll have those moments, which from years 2, 3, 4, we're starting to carry around with us, and that's getting buried. And we bury that stuff, and more of it. We think we move on, but it's still buried. And that's the stuff, if you look at people that are presenting with certainly psychological disorders later in life, much of that is still from early wounding that has been carried around. So if you imagine we're carrying that around for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, we don't need to scratch much below the surface before that is before that becomes visible and affects us. So, I'm not saying, everyone therefore needs to go and have deeply psychotherapeutic work. But we must, there's a degree of kindness and compassion to ourselves that all of us are carrying around a lot. So that's the compassion with ourselves to go, actually, there's a lot of stuff. I've got 47 years worth of stuff that I drag around with me. Lots of light and lots of dark too. But also then our compassion for others, that they are also carrying around their own woundings, their own thorns, their own kind of pulled muscles in shoulders, metaphorically and really. And perhaps that at least encourages us to go around not just being more open to our own vulnerability and others, but also going around and just being slightly more compassionate. Yeah.
Fascinating. So what gets in the way of people being vulnerable?
I think there's quite a few things. I think, whilst we're talking about vulnerability, we must recognize that there are lots of other qualities that sit alongside it. So vulnerability is just one part of the equation. And very often what is closely linked to vulnerability is shame and guilt. And whilst we may resist that moment of what we're talking about as vulnerability, that moment of me saying something to you, Neil, I need to tell you X, Y, and Z, and I disclose that piece, it often isn't that piece that we're resistant to. We may be okay to deal with that piece. It's then what happens immediately after that. So what your response is, then influences and creates the ripple effect of what comes next. So I feel shamed, or I feel guilty for how you feel. And that's often the part and the quality that people have greater resistance to, because we don't want to feel that. And at some point we've learned to feel shame, or we've learned to feel guilt. And again, real early childhood conditioning for a lot of people, that will have been the environment that they grew up in. There would have been shame and guilt, whether that was at school or with friends. So that's quite a big resistance piece to it. That does get in the way, because it isn't just about the vulnerability. It's that we don't want to feel all those feelings and have all those thoughts and stories that come the moment after we have disclosed something. It's almost the what if. I can get away with saying that thing. I can bring my truth in, but then what if? What does that open up? What's the can of worms? What's the conversation that happens? What's the meltdown that happens after that? I think a part of our almost some of the wrestle that I'm seeing with vulnerability at the moment is that we have quite a buzzword around resilience. And I talk about resilience quite a lot as, of course, it's a wonderful thing, and lots of people are writing books on resilience, and there's a lot in there. And resilience is also creating a bit of an issue for us at the moment, in that resilience ever so slightly falls into that camp of man up, pull yourself together, dig deep, find some power, push through. You can do it. It may feel tough and shit and difficult, but don't go to that place. Pick yourself up and move forward. And of course, all of this is about appropriateness in that moment. It might not be appropriate to be sobbing and disclosing all our truth in a particular environment. So therefore, we need to be able to manage it. Of course we do. But some of what resilience is creating in people is that almost just before we get to, there's a lot of richness in vulnerability. When we're feeling that discomfort of vulnerability, there's a huge amount of learning and insight and understanding to be taken from it. And very often resilience is a bit of a superhero, I think, that kind of zooms in just at the last minute and catches us almost before we get that bit of learning.
Yeah.
And I see at the moment, with resilience being such a big thing, there are lots of people that are using it in that way, which means actually we're not getting the learning. We're not going to those more difficult, uncomfortable, darker places, because the superhero sweeps in at the last moment and rescues us. So resilience is a bit of is a funny one for me, in that it can be brilliant if we use it consciously, like all of what we're talking about. If we're using it as a quality, if we're accessing resilience as a choice, because in that moment that's the right way to go, but we have self-awareness and insight that says, and there is something that still needs some time and attention, but now isn't the moment to give it that time and attention, then it can be great for us. If we're not doing that and we're using it as a bit of another safety mechanism, it almost becomes another part of a survival personality. And that's one of the things that gets in the way for us with vulnerability, is our survival personality. Our survival personality is formed in our early years, our formative years, kind of sometime between round 1, 2, 3. We start to build a cluster of little personalities within us that mean we can get through that moment. We can get through not being seen by our parent, or not being seen by a teacher, or not being listened to. And then we build up this kind of mechanism that means it's okay. And that becomes our survival personality. And therefore that becomes our armor, and that becomes our mask. And the more we get used to wearing that, the more that becomes a safer place for us to operate in. So, of course, then why do we need to be vulnerable when we have our survival personality that will rescue us anyway? So survival personality is certainly an issue. Inner critic. Some people will refer to their inner critic. Their inner critic is often, again, a wonderful nudge for us, and it raises the red flag. But if it plays a role in that it stops us from, again, staying connected to self, speaking our truth, being open, disclosing what we feel, sharing more of ourselves, letting people into our world, understanding our own world, but letting people in. If that means that becomes the gatekeeper and it becomes the bouncer, lots of us have our own internal bouncers and police force that want to keep us safe and protect us. And they do a wonderful job, and it serves a fabulous purpose that perhaps was ignited when we were 5 years old. And now at 55 years old, we go, I don't actually need that in the way that I need it at 5, but it still continues to do its job. So yeah. I think there are quite a lot of things in our own world that make vulnerability difficult. And of course, we're also battling what the world around us tells us about vulnerability, some of which we've touched on, that older narrative.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Actually, just looking at the things that get in the way of vulnerability, because there are so many of them, and they are so deep as well. So really fascinating for
And
to
normally we can justify why.
yeah.
We have every good reason. You can challenge someone on, you know, what stops the vulnerability, and people will have these wonderfully almost prepared and rehearsed narratives
Mm,
for why and why it's safer, and you know, real confirmation bias internally.
yeah.
And actually, much of that can really only be broken down and dismantled when we do start to do some work on ourselves. So whether that's a coach, or whether that's a therapist, or whether that's a part of a kind of a coaching group, or however people start to do that work on themselves, um, you know, many will need to. I know I have to be in weekly therapy for my psychotherapy training, but actually, since I started it, and I've been in and out of therapy in my lifetime, um, I kind of going, we do all need this. Who the hell are we to think that we can figure out and make sense of all of our stuff in life? Who do we think we are to know that we can see it all and see it through a clear lens
Absolutely, yeah.
and see it with compassion? We see it in a, you know, we've put our glasses on, we're seeing it from the perspective of a survival personality. And actually, who are we to do that work by ourselves? So, you
Yeah.
know, some of the people watching this will actually, the route through, if they're really serious about making some headway, will go, where do you find that place to really do the work on yourself?
It's really interesting because as you were talking, I was just thinking about a conversation I had last week with my daughter, and it was something that happened, and I went away and thought about it, came back and said, when you did that, it made me feel like this. What was happening? And she said, she gave me her perspective, which was different to the one that I was playing out in my head. We were able then to have a conversation where actually there was a very clear resolution for us both, which actually was better for us both energetically and from a health point of view, because I'm now not playing out the scenario in my head and then feeling negative about her, and she's also not doing the same about me. So, in terms of vulnerability and being healthy, I think that for me was a really good example of, and this is just me building in what you've just taught me into what just happened. So it's
Well, you,
fascinating. Yeah.
you've got an example, haven't you, of then two people speaking their truth, two people almost modeling what we would want in an ideal relationship, about staying connected to the other person. So it's done with, you know, whatever is said is said with compassion and kindness. And sometimes those, of course, they're not always easy things to say, and
No.
they won't always be received with the compassion in which they were given.
Yeah.
So they may be offered in compassion, but with compassion, we've got to remember that the person receiving it is also doing their own stuff,
Yeah.
disconnected from self, and running stories of shame and guilt. So there's an extraordinary amount at play. But what a lovely example of two people that are relating to each other,
Mm.
and staying connected to themselves, and therefore, of course, the relationship can then advance. The individually you move forward, but collectively you move forward too. And I think some of what happens if we don't have vulnerability, and this can also be one of the things that gets in the way of it, is about perfection.
Mm.
And if we if we have a strong perfection driver, that makes vulnerability also then very difficult. It makes, you know, it's how do we, if the perfection veneer is so strong, that
Yeah.
takes quite a lot to dent that, to go, how are we going to disclose that we've stuffed something up, and then own it and own our part in it?
Mm.
And it becomes very difficult to build connection, I think, when we're playing kind of a perfection veneer. Connection becomes difficult. So I think, you know, it was a lovely example of you and your daughter, and there's something really courageous in it, in you having that conversation, and then the courage to receive it and hear it, and then the courage to dialogue about it. And really, I think vulnerability is where courage is born. So if
Mm.
we want to birth more courage in our life, and you know, we are in a place in the world right now where there are more entrepreneurs than ever, more people going, actually, I don't have to live my life like this. Fuck it. You know, I want it to be different. I want it to be much more on my terms, with my rules. so that's requiring courage of people to make some different choices. And courage can only be birthed if there is vulnerability. If we just attempt to bolt on the courage, kind of like, again, tough guy courage, onto something that feels that is actually internally quite fragile, it doesn't work. So for the people going, actually, I want courage. I want to be, more courageous in my health choices and, the things I do with my life and the activities I do. Then if we don't put vulnerability and give vulnerability the same place and acknowledgement as we do the courage is built on unstable foundations.
Just as we've been talking, it just made me think that, of course, you're thinking of vulnerability, let's say from my point of view, and I'm having a conversation with you, and I may think I'm being vulnerable or not being vulnerable, but you've got your stuff you bring to that conversation as well. That there's a filter that we're both then talking through. And if we're both talking through, let's say, not being vulnerable, then we're talking through another filter that potentially is more harsh, more harmful, unhealthy, and we never get really to the truth of a matter and never really resolve anything.
It's really important just to recognize, whilst we're talking about vulnerability for ourselves, we must remember that in being in relationship with others, we will be firing off their own vulnerability concerns. So the fact that I may choose to share something with you about my life or something that happened or something that I did potentially is going to fire off a vulnerability in you because there's something I project onto you, or actually that was something that you did too that you've never talked about. And so there's so much that can be triggered. And I think the importance is, I talk about content and process. Content being the stuff, the thing we are talking about in that moment, and the process is actually what's going on around it. It's almost what the container is that holds that bit of content. And very often we get lost in the content. So I need to, tell you this thing about my difficulty with blue t-shirts, and we need to talk about blue t-shirts because I don't like dark blue and you like light blue, and I need to have that really difficult conversation with you. So we talk about the content, but actually what we fail to acknowledge is the container that sits around it and the process, which is what else is going on that isn't being talked about and named. And when we have relationships with people that we've been connected to for a while, we hope that this other stuff around the edges becomes more known. It more and more gets brought into the arena. So we go, the more it's into the arena, the more choices I have. If I keep it outside and I limit it, then it becomes really difficult to build a connection with you. So, the conversation with your daughter again, there's probably quite a lot of stuff in the arena that's known, seen, acknowledged, happened. So of course that conversation becomes much easier. But when we're talking about people where perhaps there isn't as much that is known, not as much is visible, we end up just talking about the content, and we don't acknowledge any of this stuff around the edges. And actually the stuff around the edges is really where the vulnerability is really where the edge is. That's where the learning is. That's where the courage is. That's where there's an opportunity for the relationship to emerge when we go out and start looking at the edges. But it takes a bit of daring.
That's my learning from that is my perception is not always right. So
really? Surely not.
I know, it was a hard one to learn. So give us a couple of techniques that people can actually take away and use from this conversation.
Yeah, I think I do always have a slight recoil on techniques, I think, because I probably go, techniques to be vulnerable. That means we're doing the process of doing vulnerability rather than allowing ourselves to be. So I think I would probably always give it with a bit of a health warning to go with it. And the first bit has to be actually, what's the intention? So what's the purpose of developing vulnerability for you? What is it that you're wanting from it? So I think there's a couple of almost rules that need to go around it, which is, one, it's really important that people ease into it. So it isn't binary.
Yeah.
We can't be encouraging people to go, no vulnerability in your world, to be completely vulnerable. It's just complete nonsense and not good for you and not good for others. So the whole ease into it piece would be my first would be my first bit of thought on it, which is actually go slow and be really specific about a relationship in a context that you believe you want to improve. And that's improving for the other person, that's improving for the two of you, and it's also improving in terms of the connection to self. So it'll probably be a relationship that feels that you're a little bit restless with, that doesn't feel quite right and you don't necessarily know why. And a part of that is because there's a disconnection from self. The relationships that you believe are in flow and quite easy, and you feel as though stuff's brought into the room, then I would just let those sit, and I would look for a relationship that you feel, and that may be a relationship, it may be starting with the relationship with yourself more than a relationship with another, is to go ease in. We're talking kind of 1 degree piece, tiny adaptation, a tiny acknowledgement that you want it to be a little bit better than it is now. So that would be the first piece for me. There is the second step in it, I think, is about practicing, and I think this is quite a tough quality for people, and little talked about, is one of acceptance. And acceptance is actually just giving ourselves permission to be in the place that we are in that moment.
Mm.
And that's about, acceptance can be much easier for us when stuff is good, when life feels good and in flow and we're happy and we can accept it and sit with it. Real acceptance, the challenge is when life feels difficult and a bit overwhelming and tough and uncomfortable and challenging, how then do we accept? And acceptance comes a little bit before vulnerability, I think, is something about our comfort to be with and be present with wherever we are in this moment. And I think there's a really great question that just disconnects us from the story and the drama that we're in, which is, where am I now? Just simply by asking that question, where am I now, means that we stand back from the scenario, from the thing, from the story that can be quite seductive, and the drama that can be quite seductive, is just to give ourselves a bit of space and to go, where am I now? And the moment we go, where am I now, there is space for acceptance of feelings, of thoughts. We don't have to take them on and buy them and make them our own, but we can observe them. And then from there, there's also the opportunity to then set an intention for what we want next. So where am I now? And actually, where do I want this to be? Where do I, how do I want to impact and affect this relationship or this interaction with this person? We're talking about building a muscle here. Vulnerability is a muscle and a quality that we can build. And I think a really healthy place to start is to actually just to do a bit of a vulnerability pulse check. And if that means from journaling for 7 days, or just having a notebook with you and just capturing in what spaces, in what contexts, with what people are you more comfortable to disclose and be vulnerable and own your mistakes, and where are you not? Where are there some environments where you go, I can't do it there? Because a lot of people will resist it in a work environment. It's often more challenging to bring vulnerability into a work environment than it is in some of our other environments, because it feels like there's more at stake, and it feels like, again, there are more beliefs that we should sign up to that perhaps operate within that culture. So I think a bit of an inventory check, a bit of a sense check is the first place to go to start spotting patterns. And that will then, I think, inform the work really of where do you ease in? Where do you start to observe the moments in your life where you are already vulnerable? So what's that like, and what's different there? What's different? What different characters are at play? What different story comes into play when we're vulnerable there, but then when we don't believe we can do it there? And that's often will be the survival personality, the inner critic comes into play. So personally, I'd go with journaling. I'd go with the practice of acceptance first, from asking that question, where am I now? And I would go really light touch. This is, like any relationship, if we want to build a relationship that's sustainable, then we need to go with care, and we need to go with sensitivity, and we need to go with awareness. And we're talking really about reigniting relationship with self.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. Whilst we're putting it in the context of others, because it will often play out there, actually this is about the vulnerability that we are prepared to show to ourselves. How prepared are we to look in the mirror and see everything?
Cool. So, Richard, whenever I'm interviewing our experts, I'd like to ask them to leave me and our community, whoever wants to play this game, to leave us with a challenge, something that we can do for a day or for a week or for a month around the topic that we've been talking about today.
So I would. I'd probably say it's a do for a day thing and see what it gives you, which is you remember that old game show Name That Tune? Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Bloody hated that program. My parents, I'm sure, made me watch it. I'm sure that's where much of my wounding and childhood trauma comes from. But I think play the game show Name That Feeling.
Okay.
And just a day. So, and that's Name That Feeling. Now, there's a choice as to whether you name it to others.
Yeah.
That may be if you're feeling daring enough and brave enough to go, I'm just going to name that feeling. And you need to obviously, it's probably a good idea to bring the people that you're spending that time with for that day into that game that you're playing it, rather than just suddenly going, I'm feeling unsure.
Yeah.
I've got a feeling of concern and worry right now. It's going to be a little bit odd. So probably best to bring them.
Yeah.
You can play it solo, which is just have a notebook and throughout your day, name that feeling. So just name what is going on. Look, in order for us to wrap our arms around the idea of vulnerability, there's a beginning to dethrone our rational mind is really important. So our rational mind will often lie to us and tell us fibs and make up stories. And actually the truth is in our felt sense. So our gut feel, what our body is telling us, what physiologically we are feeling and noticing, actually that's where the truth exists. It never lies. There's a wonderful book, The Body Keeps the Score, which is purely capturing that whole sense of the body remembers. The brain makes up stories and narratives that make it acceptable. But the body keeps the score, the body holds it. And so for us to start noticing, name that feeling, actually just beginning to tune into our felt sense. I know that sounds a bit kind of like unicorny, but it isn't. It's about just letting this go for a moment, just quieten this down and tune into what the rest of the system is telling you in that moment. And that doesn't need to be right. It just needs to be for you going, that is the best reflection I can come up with. It's not about a perfect one or a right one. It's going, just use the word that comes to mind. We don't need to overthink it, but just name it. And they might be feelings of lightness and joy and happiness, and they may be heavier feelings of worry or upset or pain. But we might be that you can locate it in your body. Name the feeling. Where is it in the body? How does it feel? Almost on a 0 to 10. 10, it's really extreme. 0, it's hardly there. Just name it, put it down, and then just let it go. And that the level of that insight, actually, there's something really rich in there. And if what we're talking about is encouraging people to disclose more of themselves for themselves and for others, that first bit has to be, we've got to start noticing. We have to start paying attention.
Richard, brilliant. Thank you for that challenge. Really do appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to having a go at that one myself. I think I will let other people in on it as well. Although maybe not. Let's see. Let's see.
Watch.
Yeah, because what I will do is I will put my findings from that. I'll put into another video so that
cool. Do that.
How I've done it. So that might be quite entertaining. So I'll be doing that. Richard, thank you for your time and your insights today into being vulnerable and being healthy. I really do appreciate that.
Pleasure. It's always good to talk to you, and I think it's such a hot topic. What we talked about right at the start is that, people are tired of other people not owning their mistakes, and humanity is wanting to live in this place that is more truthful, more honest, discloses more, and then we just kind of cut through the bullshit and the facade and the perfection and the armour, and we get back to something that is more real and human. We're desperate for that. We've lived with a deficit of that for too long.
So from that conversation with Richard, I'm just thinking that it takes courage to be vulnerable, to be honest, maybe to be truthful about some situations as well. But when we are, maybe we gain perspective, a different perspective from other people around us, or even a different perspective from within us. And it gives us opportunities to be different, to maybe reach for those things that we really want to have in life. So yeah, I thought it was a really interesting conversation. My question to you is, how do you feel about the challenge that Richard has given us? Are you going to take part in that challenge? If you are, please do tell us in the comments. Tell us how you get on in the comments. I'm certainly going to take it on. And I will also do a video in the next few weeks about my attempts at that challenge, so that you can follow along with what I did. And if you want to get that video and all of our latest uploads, please do subscribe to the channel. And if the channel can be of help to your friends and family, please also share the channel with them too. If you really want to get proactive with your health, then Total Wellness Club are developing health quests over at questly.life. Join now while we're developing the site, and you'll get access to health quests and be able to immediately personalise your health by identifying which of 10 critical health categories need your focus the most. You'll also be able to track your progress, and you'll also be able to help us develop the platform over time as well. So that's questly.life. I'll put a link into the description below, and I'll see you in the next video.